Hope you're all doing well today. We have another jaw-dropping story lined up that I think will keep you on the edge of your seat from start to finish. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far and wide our viewers come from. Now, let's get down to business. Imagine living next to someone so entitled that they treat your property like it's their own personal domain. That's exactly what happened to Roy, our storyteller for today. He's a quiet, law-abiding homeowner who just wants to live in peace. But his new neighbor, Cheryl, turns out to be the kind of neighbor who pokes her nose into places it doesn't belong. And in Roy's case, it's literally his garage. How does he handle such a blatant violation of his privacy and property rights? Well, you're about to find out. Trust me, the way Roy deals with this situation is both clever and satisfying. So buckle up, everyone. Get ready for the details. Now, let's step into Roy's shoes and hear exactly what happened from his perspective. HOA Karen parked in my garage, so I sold it for scrap. My name's Roy. I'm a software developer by profession, and I have the privilege of working from home most days of the week. My job is intense at times. It can involve long stretches of coding, debugging, and Zoom calls with clients. Because of that, I value a peaceful environment. I'm the type who craves quiet and calm so I can focus on my projects. I'm not a recluse by any means, but I enjoy my personal space. A few years back, time really does fly. I bought my first home in a suburban neighborhood. From the outside, it's a perfectly ordinary place. Rows of neat houses, trimmed lawns, families walking dogs, kids playing ball in the street. The neighborhood is governed by a homeowners association, which maintains certain standards for how properties should look and function. Admittedly, I was a bit nervous about the HOA aspect because I've heard the stories. Petty rules, overbearing board members, and the occasional neighbor who uses the rulebook like a personal weapon. But the house I found was too good to pass up. The price was right, the location was perfect, and it had a detached garage that I envisioned converting into the ultimate office space. The garage conversion was a project I poured my heart into. I made sure every step was taken legally, proper permits, inspections, the whole works. When it was finished, it became my dream workspace. It's insulated, wired up for high-speed internet, and even has a mini fridge for those late nights or early mornings when I need coffee or a quick snack without trudging back into the main house. Sure, I lost the garage for parking my car, but I still have a decent driveway and a small carport on the side for sheltering my vehicle if it rains. In this particular area, snow is rare, so I figured a fully enclosed garage wasn't a necessity for me. My original plan was to keep to myself, do my work, occasionally wave to the neighbors, and respect the HOA rules so I wouldn't draw unwanted attention. For a while, it worked out exactly as I'd hoped. Most folks around here are friendly enough, or at least they keep their distance. But then Cheryl moved in next door. Cheryl arrived with plenty of fanfare. The day she moved in, large trucks and movers took up half the street. She introduced herself to me by knocking on my door to complain about how my car was parked, even though it was perfectly within my own driveway. That was my first sign that she might be a little particular. Within her first few weeks in the neighborhood, Cheryl ran for a spot on the HOA board. Usually, new residents take time to settle in before they start joining committees and boards, but not Cheryl. She seemed to be on a mission to exert influence from day one. I started hearing rumblings from other neighbors about her. She was apparently taking morning walks and jotting down violations in a little notebook. Rumor or not, it wasn't hard to believe once I got my first official complaint letter. It read something about my succulent garden not being approved vegetation under HOA guidelines. I'd carefully chosen succulents because they're low maintenance and drought tolerant, and I had seen others in the neighborhood with similar plants. Still, I received a formal notice. Then came another complaint. My garbage bin was left out too long after trash collection day. I'm usually diligent about rolling it back in, but sometimes work calls run late, or I forget for a few hours. Apparently, that was enough for a second warning. I tried to brush it off, figuring it was just Cheryl being overzealous. In reality, it started feeling less like simple rule enforcement and more like personal policing. I tried not to take it to heart. After all, the HOA has to maintain the look of the neighborhood, and maybe Cheryl genuinely believed she was helping. but her tone was consistently authoritarian, as if she was itching to find a reason to scold. Over the next few months, I managed to keep my interactions with Cheryl to a polite minimum. A forced smile here, a short nod there, and that was it. Yet, I had the growing sense that she was keeping an eye on me more than she was on any other neighbor. I occasionally saw her peering over her fence at my yard, or walking by my driveway more than once when I had the carport door open. There was something unsettling in the way she observed me, like she was searching for the slightest transgression to pounce on. What bothered me the most wasn't the official letters or the quiet stares. It was the sense that my peace, a peace I'd worked hard to maintain, was being chipped away. I'd moved here for tranquility, especially because I worked from home. The idea of having an HOA that policed trivial matters was one thing, but having a neighbor who used the HOA as her personal enforcement tool was another entirely. Then came the day that changed everything, the day she parked her car in my carport without asking. It was a stormy afternoon, the kind where dark clouds roll in suddenly, and you can practically feel the electricity in the air. I'd been on an important Zoom call with a client discussing a big software rollout. My headphones were on, and I was trying to concentrate on the conversation. Between thunderclaps, I vaguely heard a car horn blaring, but I was in the middle of speaking, so I ignored it. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside to stretch my legs and see what the ruckus was. That's when I saw Cheryl's car, sitting under my carport as if it belonged there. She was leaning against the driver's side door, tapping on her phone. I walked toward her, and the moment she noticed me, she waved me over as if to say, "Finally, you came out." "Hey," I said, doing my best to keep my tone neutral. "Is everything okay?" She smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes and responded, "Oh, I just needed a place to park because the street's flooding." Admittedly, there were some pretty big puddles forming along the curbs, but to me that was no reason to commandeer my carport. With measured politeness, I said, "I understand the weather is bad, but you really should have asked. This is private property, and it's for my car." Her demeanor changed in a blink. She went from politely dismissive to outright offended. "You don't own the rain," she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's an emergency situation, and the HOA rules allow for emergency measures." I was taken aback. I wasn't aware of any rule that says you can park in someone else's carport just because of a storm, I replied calmly, though my frustration was bubbling beneath the surface. She gave a shrug and said, "Well, we can talk about that at the next HOA meeting." Then she got into her car and reversed out, leaving me standing there in the drizzle, my heart thumping with annoyance. In the weeks that followed, a proposed new regulation circulated among the HOA members, a rule forcing homeowners to share parking during emergency weather conditions. The moment I saw it, I knew exactly who was behind the proposal. It listed reasons like public safety, flood avoidance, and other legal-sounding phrases that seemed carefully crafted to justify someone's personal convenience. I voiced my objection via email, stating that while I understood the need for cooperation among neighbors during truly dire situations, this rule was too vague and easily exploitable. My concern was obvious. It would give people like Cheryl carte blanche to decide what constituted an emergency. But by then, Cheryl had already rallied a few sympathizers who believed it was a good neighborly gesture. The rule passed by a narrow margin. That incident sowed a seed of distrust in me. If Cheryl had the audacity to park in my carport without asking, and then manipulate the HOA rules to validate her actions, what else was she willing to do? A few weeks after the carport fiasco, I had to run errands and ended up working from a coffee shop downtown for most of the day. By the time I returned home, I noticed something was off. The side door of my converted garage, my private office, was slightly ajar. My first thought was that I must have forgotten to lock it before I left, but that was unusual. I'm meticulous about home security. Cautiously, I approached and peeked inside. To my utter shock, there sat Cheryl's SUV. Right there, in my garage, next to my desk and computer setup. My heart dropped. In that moment, 1,000 questions bounced around my head. Had she forced her way in? Had I left the code unchanged from before? Or was something more sinister going on? I found a small handwritten note taped to my office chair. It read, "Needed a place to park. The old code still worked. Hope you don't mind." No apology, no sense of wrongdoing, just an exclamation mark as if we were best friends sharing a garage. My mind raced. The old code had been something I'd shared with Cheryl months earlier for a one-time inspection of a minor construction detail. She'd asked to see how I'd installed the new insulation because she was considering a similar project for her house. I'd given her the keypad code because she'd said she wanted to check it quickly while I was out. I changed the code right after that, or so I thought. Yet, apparently, she'd either memorized or stored that code somewhere and noticed I hadn't updated it. I stood there, anger and disbelief swirling inside me. Who does that? The sense of violation was intense. This was my office, my personal workspace, not some communal area. She had no right, no permission to just waltz in and park her car. I went outside and double-checked the keypad. Sure enough, the digital lock was still set to the old code. My memory must have failed me when I thought I'd updated it. Immediately, I changed it then and there, punching in a new combination and testing it to make sure it worked. But first, I had to move her car. Given that her SUV was parked right in the center of my garage, I didn't feel comfortable driving it. Instead, I waited. And sure enough, Cheryl came strolling over about an hour later, wearing a casual smile like she was just dropping by a friend's house. "Hi, Roy," she greeted, voice unnervingly cheerful. "Is something wrong? I noticed you changed the code." I stared at her, taking a slow breath to remain composed. "Yes, I did. I came home and found your car in my garage. Again without my permission. This is a private space. You can't just park here whenever you feel like it." She laughed. "Relax. No harm done, right?" The weather was looking bad, and I thought, better safe than sorry. She moved towards the driver's seat as if she expected me to simply wave it off. I stood my ground. "Cheryl, this isn't a matter of weather or convenience. You trespassed on my property. Do you understand that? I want to make it crystal clear, this cannot happen again. If it does, I'll have to consider taking legal action." That's when she rolled her eyes, and her face twisted in annoyance. "Fine," she muttered. "I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but whatever. I'll move." Then she got into her SUV and drove away, leaving me seething. That night, I lay awake in bed. A million thoughts rushed through my mind. Was I dealing with a neighbor who simply had no boundaries, or was there something more? Her casual attitude unsettled me. She'd practically laughed in my face when I mentioned the word trespassing. Despite my frustration, I tried to stay calm. I believed in following legal channels if necessary, and I suspected that if I tried to confront her with hostility, it would only escalate things further. Little did I know, her sense of entitlement was about to peak in the most audacious way possible. Not more than a week had passed since the garage incident. I'd spent most of that week hyper-focused on work, partly to distract myself and partly to keep my schedule flexible in case Cheryl tried anything else. However, there are always errands to run. One day, I had to step out to handle some banking and shopping. I was gone for maybe 3 hours. When I returned, I saw the side door of my garage office slightly open, even though I'd locked it. My stomach sank. This was déjà vu, but worse because I'd already changed the code. Panic set in for a second. Had she figured out my new code? I ran over, turned on the lights, and there it was. Her SUV, yet again, parked inside my garage. This time, no note, no friendly greeting. It was as if she assumed it was her personal storage space. I felt my blood boil. Every ounce of frustration from the past months converged in that moment. All the time she nitpicked about my succulents or trash bins, all the so-called emergency carport fiascos, and now, for the second time, she had brazenly used my private workspace. Something in me snapped, but instead of raging or yelling, I chose a different path. I remembered a story I'd heard once about someone towing away a car parked illegally, and it gave me an idea. What if Cheryl believed I'd actually sold her car for scrap? It sounded wild, but at this point, so was everything about this situation. If words and courtesy hadn't worked, maybe she needed a taste of her own medicine, a scenario where she'd feel the very real consequences of her disregard for other people's property. I called a friend of mine who runs a small towing and storage service. He owed me a favor from years back, so he was game to help. Within the hour, a tow truck arrived, quietly, as we didn't want to alert Cheryl. The driver carefully loaded Cheryl's SUV and took it to a secure lot several miles away, one that stored repossessed vehicles and sometimes scrapped ones. The cost came out of my own pocket, but in that moment it felt worth it. Then I waited. I sat in my house, working on my laptop, occasionally checking through the window for any signs of Cheryl. Sure enough, that evening, a loud banging rattled my front door. I opened it to find Cheryl, looking anxious and furious at the same time. Her words rushed out. "Where's my car? Did you move it again? I can't find it anywhere." I feigned a concerned frown. "Your car? Oh, you mean the one that was in my garage again?" She glared at me, hands planted firmly on her hips. "Yes, where is it?" With the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "Well, you left it on my property without permission. As far as I could tell, it was abandoned. So I sold it for scrap." The look on her face was one I'll never forget, pure shock, mingled with disbelief and outrage. She sputtered, "Why, you did what?" I put on an apologetic expression, even as my heart pounded from the adrenaline. "You seem to have no interest in respecting my property rights. I assumed you didn't want the vehicle anymore, so I took the liberty of selling it. Sorry if there was a misunderstanding." Her voice exploded into a shriek. "You can't do that. That's theft. I'm calling the police. You'll be in so much trouble." She waved her phone around as if brandishing a weapon. I kept my composure. "Go ahead and do what you have to do. But if you need the proof, I have security footage of you trespassing multiple times, ignoring my warnings. I also have the HOA letters from you complaining about ridiculous things, establishing a pattern of harassment." I let that last bit sink in, though I knew I might have been stretching the definition of harassment. Cheryl's face turned red. She unleashed a string of angry words. Some curses, some threats, some declarations that she knew the law better than I did. Finally, she stormed off. And that was it. I closed my door, my heart still hammering. I called my friend at the storage lot, confirming the SUV was safe and giving him a heads up that the next 24 hours could be eventful. He assured me that he would store the vehicle discreetly until I told him otherwise. Little did I know, the next confrontation would come not from Cheryl directly, but from her husband. It was about an hour after Cheryl's meltdown when another knock came at my door. My nerves were still on edge, so I looked through the peephole before opening. I recognized him. Cheryl's husband, a tall, broad-shouldered man I'd only seen in passing. He rarely seemed to be around. I assumed he traveled a lot or worked long hours. I cautiously opened the door. "Yes." He wasted no time. "Listen, you've messed with the wrong family," he snarled. His fists were clenched, and there was an unmistakable threat in his eyes. "Where's my wife's car?" I stood firmly on my porch, refusing to be intimidated. "It's not on your property, and that's all you need to know right now. If you've got a complaint, maybe we should settle this legally, because I'm done with these trespassing games." His cheeks puffed out in anger. "You think you can just take someone else's car? That's grand theft auto," he shouted, stepping forward as if to physically confront me. I didn't flinch. I kept my posture straight, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "Your wife parked that car in my garage multiple times without permission," I said, my voice measured. "I warned her. She ignored me. She left it there again, so I made a decision to remove it." He let out a scornful laugh. "You're going to regret this. We'll make sure of it." But there was something in his expression, maybe a flicker of doubt or a realization that they'd pushed me too far, that suggested he knew Cheryl was wrong. Perhaps he recognized that intimidation wouldn't magically fix their problem or rewrite the fact that Cheryl had repeatedly trespassed. After a tense standoff that felt like ages but was probably only seconds, he turned and left without another word. No police were called then, no further confrontation. I watched him march back to his house, slamming the door behind him. I exhaled a long breath and checked my phone. It was still early evening, but my nerves were shot, and I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I wondered if I should call the police first or consult a lawyer. In the end, I decided to wait for Cheryl or her husband to make the next move. If they did call the police, I had footage plus every written warning I'd given. And if they decided to escalate with the HOA, so be it. At least this saga would be out in the open, and I could tell my side of the story. Days passed without any direct confrontation. No officers showed up at my door. No new letters arrived in my mailbox. But then an email notification landed in my inbox, announcing an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was cryptic. Important property dispute discussion. Attendance strongly advised. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it had something to do with Cheryl's dramatic claims. She'd likely painted me as a villain, accusing me of theft and harassment, and demanded immediate HOA intervention. For a moment, I considered not going. The whole ordeal felt petty and draining, but I knew I had to be there to defend myself and present the facts. So, on a bright Thursday evening, I arrived at the HOA meeting hall. It's a modest space usually used for casual gatherings or official HOA business. This time it was packed. Word had spread that something major had gone down between me and Cheryl. The air buzzed with curiosity and tension. I took a seat near the front, carrying a folder of documents. Security footage stills, printouts of my warnings to Cheryl, and copies of her frivolous complaints about my succulents and trash bins. My lawyer, a level-headed person I'd consulted earlier, joined me. He'd come to ensure that if things got heated or if legal threats were hurled my way, I'd have someone to back me up. Cheryl sat on the opposite side of the room, next to her husband, looking smug in an official HOA board seat. Her arms were crossed, her eyes glaring at me. Eventually, the board president called the meeting to order and, after some preliminary announcements, opened the floor to address the alleged theft of Cheryl's SUV. Cheryl didn't hesitate. She launched into a tirade, describing how I had maliciously and vindicatively seized her vehicle and caused her emotional distress. She pounded the table for emphasis and demanded the HOA remove me from the community or impose severe penalties. She even had a couple of supporters standing behind her, nodding along. Then it was my turn. I stepped up, feeling a rush of adrenaline but keeping my voice calm. I have documented proof that Cheryl trespassed on my property multiple times, against my explicit instructions. I also have an entire archive of notes and security camera footage showing that her SUV was parked in my private garage without permission. Not once, but twice. I held up the still shots taken from the security camera, a clear image of her vehicle pulling into my garage, the date stamps visible. A murmur rippled through the room. Then I took a small breath and turned to address the entire meeting. And as for selling her car for scrap, I paused for dramatic effect. I have a confession. I didn't actually sell it. I had it towed and stored. But I wanted Cheryl to see what it feels like when someone else takes over your property without your say-so. It wasn't theft. It was a demonstration of what repeated trespassing can lead to if someone decides to take matters into their own hands. You could have heard a pin drop. For a moment, Cheryl looked triumphant, as if she'd won by me admitting it wasn't actually sold. But the hush that followed told a different story. People realized exactly what I was pointing out. Cheryl had repeatedly crossed a legal and moral boundary, and my reaction, while extreme, highlighted the seriousness of her actions. Then the board asked me to play a few short clips from my security camera. I obliged, showing Cheryl's SUV entering my garage in broad daylight. Another clip displayed her returning later to retrieve it, ignoring my written notes. The evidence was clear, and the board members exchanged looks, some outraged, some embarrassed on Cheryl's behalf. Cheryl's face turned pale. She tried to sputter out explanations. I was just using it for an emergency. He said it was fine before. He gave me the code. But none of it held water against the video evidence and my repeated explicit warnings. The final blow came when neighbors started sharing their own experiences. One recounted how Cheryl threatened them with a major fine for leaving a garden hose uncoiled. Another how she demanded they trim their hedges to a specific height on a whim. Several mentioned she had casually suggested that her friend on the board could make life difficult for anyone who refused to comply. The more people spoke, the more obvious it became that Cheryl was a bully using the HOA's rules as her personal arsenal. The board president, who had been neutral until then, finally addressed Cheryl. "We appreciate your previous service on the HOA board, but this behavior is unacceptable. Our community guidelines are here to protect the neighborhood, not to be misused for personal vendettas. Your actions, trespassing, intimidation, violate the very principles we stand for." Cheryl sat there, red-faced, as an emergency vote was called to remove her from the board immediately. Passed with a landslide majority. She tried to argue that I'd orchestrated a smear campaign, but the evidence was too damning. Once the meeting concluded, the tension in the room hung thick. I stayed behind to talk to a few neighbors who wanted more details. Many congratulated me for standing up for myself. Some, however, pulled me aside to voice their concern that my approach, pretending to sell her car, was risky. I acknowledged that it was a gamble, but one that I felt forced into. They nodded, understanding that I'd tried reason first, to no avail. In the days that followed, it was as if a dam had broken. People who had been too timid to speak up about Cheryl's overreach began reporting old stories and violations she had pinned on them. The HOA board, now free from her influence, promised a thorough review of its policies to ensure no one else could abuse the system as Cheryl had. They also made it clear that real emergencies, like serious flooding or natural disasters, might warrant shared resources, but it would involve direct communication and official guidelines, not random trespassing. Cheryl, on the other hand, kept a low profile. Her once frequent presence, inspecting lawns, peeking into windows, seemed to vanish overnight. I'd see her husband come and go, but not her. Rumor had it she was putting the house on the market. Indeed, not long after, a for sale sign appeared in front of their yard. A few neighbors said they saw prospective buyers touring the place, but Cheryl never accompanied them. I guess she was humiliated, too embarrassed to face the people she'd spent so long trying to dominate. A few weeks later, moving trucks arrived early in the morning. By midday, they were loaded and gone. I was in my garage office, finishing up some design work, when I heard a car door slam. I stepped out, partly from curiosity, partly from wanting closure. There was Cheryl standing by her car. She caught sight of me. For a moment, we locked eyes. Then she looked down, a look of defeat, or perhaps regret, flickering across her face. I gave a small nod, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement that this chapter was ending. She climbed into her car, and just like that, she drove away. With Cheryl gone, the neighborhood vibe shifted. A weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. The HOA took steps to ensure fairness, no more ambiguous rules that one person could manipulate. The new board even hosted a community potluck to foster a more neighborly spirit. I made sure to attend, partly to set an example that despite everything, I was invested in maintaining a positive relationship with everyone else. As for my garage office, I had the keypad changed twice for good measure, and added another layer of security with a motion detector. My next-door neighbors, the ones on the other side who had never given me any trouble, noticed the new devices and asked if everything was okay. I told them a bit of the story, and they shook their heads in disbelief at Cheryl's audacity. It's been months now, and life has mostly returned to normal. I no longer worry about stepping outside to find someone else's car in my workspace. My succulents are thriving. Turns out they're perfectly fine under updated HOA guidelines, especially now that no one's itching to use them as a reason to cause trouble. I still keep all my documentation from that ordeal, though. You never know when you might need proof that you were justified in taking action, especially when dealing with difficult neighbors. I learned a valuable lesson in boundary setting. Before, I might have let small things slide. Cheryl's condescending remarks, her random checks for violations, her sense of entitlement. But each time I tried to be polite, it only emboldened her more. Eventually, it took a drastic measure for her to realize that she couldn't walk all over me. It wasn't just about her car. It was about my right to feel safe and respected in my own home. And that's the story, guys. There's no denying it was a roller coaster. Starting with small aggravations like complaints over plants and garbage bins, all the way to someone brazenly letting themselves into a private garage. It's the kind of situation that makes you shake your head in disbelief. But, as we've all seen, things like this do happen in real life, especially when HOA rules can be interpreted in ways that allow for personal power plays. Now, here's my take on it. Roy handled the situation with a mix of patience, evidence gathering, and a dash of creativity. He didn't charge in yelling or start slinging threats. He documented everything. He tried being direct and civil, and only when that failed did he set up a scenario where Cheryl would truly understand the impact of her actions. Some might say his tactic was extreme, but in the end, it worked. Cheryl was forced to confront the ramifications of treating someone else's property as her own. If you're facing a similar situation, remember this: document everything. Written complaints, photos, security footage, timestamps. These are your best defenses if someone is constantly infringing on your rights. And, if the matter escalates, consult a legal professional. As Roy showed us, you don't need to resort to violence or intimidation. Calm, methodical steps backed by evidence can be incredibly powerful. For people who might find themselves in Cheryl's position, thinking it's no big deal to overstep on someone else's property, think twice. Trespassing is illegal for a reason. It violates someone's sense of safety and ownership. And threatening someone after you've already broken the rules only digs you deeper into trouble. If you have issues with a neighbor, your best path is respectful communication and, if that fails, legal or community-based mediation, not invading their personal space. Finally, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and drop a comment. Let us know your thoughts. Do you think Roy went too far? Or did he give Cheryl exactly the lesson she needed? We love hearing your perspectives. Thank you for watching Tale-strum, where real stories meet real consequences. Until next time, stay respectful out there, folks, and take care of each other. We'll see you soon for another eye-opening story.